Welcome to the Stoa, Wisdom Cults or Wisdom Commons with Jamie Wheal, Dave Snowden, Bonita Roy, and Jill Nephew. One way to look at this session is how can we avoid creating wisdom cults and instead create a wisdom commons, a place that makes wisdom more common. And for this exploration, we have a wisdom-packed panel with 4 guests. Jamie Wheal from the Flow Genome Project and author of Recapture the Rapture. We have Jill Nephew from Inqwire and creator of Lucidly, an inquiry software that helps engender what she calls a natural intelligence. Dave Snowden, the sense-making mensch himself and creator of the Cynefin framework. And to round off that panel, we had Bonita Roy join us last minute from the pop-up school. So the inspiration for the session was Dave's last session at the Stoa, where he basically brought out all his sense-making guns and took out the entire meta-modern scene and the liminal web. And a lot of conversations rippled out from that session. So I thought it'd be good to have a follow-up session where we could be proactive and address some of the concerns regarding cult-like dynamics emerging when publicly talking about wisdom and those who recommend practices to become more wise. One thing I get a perverse pleasure of here from the Stoa is arranging these panel conversations with interesting configurations that you haven't seen anyplace else. And for the most part, they go usually pretty well, but there's always a risk of it being super awkward. So if that happens, please blame my foolishness for arranging the session. But I sense it will go well. Because what I like about this particular configuration is that they all have critical voices directed towards people talking about wisdom. Jamie has been critical of certain like mushy elements of the integral scene and created this excellent checklist to spot cult-like dynamics emerging in spiritual circles, which I linked on the event description. Jill has witnessed certain dynamics in wisdom communities that she was involved in the 80s, which promoted a critical eye around conversations surrounding wisdom today. And she has been critical of the liminal web. Dave has 1 or 2 critical moments, including this last session. And then Bonita is engaging in some really interesting criticism on John Vervaeke's After Socrates series. She's calling that Before Socrates, which I recommend checking out. So we'll begin now. And everyone except the panelists can just turn off their camera. Heightens the intimacy, and then it's good for the YouTube channel. And so the starting question is this one right here. Can publicly discussing wisdom while recommending wisdom practices oriented towards making one more wise, lead to cult-like dynamics? If so, how? So this question is just kind of a prompt. It can go anywhere. The conversation can go anywhere it likes. But the idea is for each panelist to take turns answering it, 3 to 5 minutes. And then after each one answers it, then a free associative conversation for about 45 to 60 minutes emerges. And we'll try to get some of the questions after. And so the order will be Jamie, Jill, Dave, and Bonita. So Jamie, I'll take you in a moment, and then after you go, taking Jill, and then Jill taking Dave, and then Dave taking Bonita. Then we need to open up the space, and then I'll pop my camera back on around the 60-minute mark, and then we can switch to the Q&A. So that being said, I'll spotlight the videos and tag Jamie in, and Jamie, let me know if you need any further context. You can unmute yourself now, yeah.
Great. And if you don't mind, just let me know sort of a minute to wrap up kind of thing. That would be great.
Cool. Can I put it in the chat? Is that
sure? And this was roughly sort of a 3 to 5 minute.
3 to 5 minute, yeah.
Kind of thing. Okay. Well, first of all, hello to everybody. And this is an infinite subject, right? How do we humans do the messy human thing in groups, and how do we sort and stack our search for truth and community and social positioning? We are tribal primates, and when anybody is bringing anything of perceived value, in this case we're sort of calling it wisdom, all sorts of hijinks and mayhem ensue, so I feel like there's at least, I mean, there's 1,000 ways to discuss this, but at least one is, what is sort of anthropologically, what are the anthropological structures, aka this is always the way it's gone down, more or less, with infinite variation, but like this is the human thing. And then what are there any things that are unique or particular to our moment in time, to our digital platforms, to our bleeding of commerce, to the temping of academia, to the, public pundit, DIY, Patreon scene, like all of those kind of things. And are they exacerbating or ameliorating any of those anthropological conditions? So I think for sure, we are seeing a strange blending where there used to be more distinct spaces and places. And if you take the kind of academics in exile as one bucket, so you kind of have the Jordan Petersons, you have the Brett and Heather Weinstein, you have a lot of people, Sam Harris, even with a PhD in neuroscience, but then commentating on Islam, all of those kind of things. So we sort of have both, how do people make their way and make a living, and what market incentives impact what they have to share and how they share it and who they share it to for what value exchange, explicit or implied. And that could be like, share, comment, repost. It could be go to my Patreon page and make a, rattling the tin cup. Like if you like, Substack, if you like this for free, there's a paywall, right? There's a, or here's my course or my program after I've established trust and intimacy. There's all sorts of these funky things that are happening and appear to lead to, I mean, at least I think my under considered observation is it tends to make things worse. Whatever the anthropological conditions are of how do you deal with any form of alpha charisma, and this is like Max Weber's notions of authority, like, there's legal authority, there's sort of moral authority, and there's sort of charismatic authority, and they kind of switch around. Like legal is I'm the cop, so you listen to me, moral is I'm the priest, and charismatic is like I've got the juice. This could be an artist or a musician or, or a pundit, on Twitter. And so it does seem like we're having all of those things overlapping and crashing and smashing into each other at the same time that we, postmodernism into meta poly crisis, whatever you want to call our current shit show. More and more people are unmoored from prior traditional deference to hierarchy systems, handed down knowledge, whatever it might be. So we're all more and more adrift, the spiritual but not religious, and into that void, into that vacuum, are coming all sorts of pundits to gurus. And once that happens, and now go, so just saying that's sort of a very messy gloss of right now. To go back to the anthropological, whether it's we're tribal primates, whether it's we all have unmet family systems needs, whatever it is, when somebody comes through with potentially charismatic authority, we tend to do one of four things, which is, this goes to Lisa Feldman Barrett's notions of interoception, like how do we feel in our system, in our guts? We either have a positive affect or a negative affect. We're either attracted or repelled by them. And it's either active or passive. We either want to do something about that attraction or repulsion, or we simply receive it. So if we are passively attracted, we want to follow them. If we are actively attracted, quite often that merges into the sexual erotic. We get confused, right? And so we want to fuck them. If we are negatively passive, we tend to fear them. And if we are negatively active, we want to fight them. So the sort of fear, fight, follow, fuck are typically are very easy quadrants of how most of this stuff goes down fairly often and fairly predictably. And I think that, and certainly with everybody gathered here, my guess is that's not particularly interesting to any of us, either, personally or collectively. And what we are exploring is some version of feeling it. Can we create communitas? Can we create a sense of a shared, and whether this is group flow, whether this is, Otto Scharmer's U theory, you take your pick as to who's taken cracks at this Victor Turner's notion of communitas, like when we get together and we feel that there is some kind of co-creative interdependent thing, it's amazing. And how do we do that without giving away our agency, right, into unhealthy ways and unhealthy positions and authority? So, to me, those are just the questions I would have. And I'm happy to pause here and pass it on. I think, Jill, were you jumping in next?
No. Thank you, Jamie. That's very complimentary to where I wanted to take this. I completely agree with all that, especially this idea that just kind of potentially opens the floodgate for maybe a new class. You name it, the masses will come in our new shared world. Very much echo that position. I was trying to think of the best way I could contribute to this panel in 3 to 5 minutes. So I'm trying to boil down a lot of concepts in a very short amount of time. So I apologize in advance if I just smash my words together. But I wanted to first set up a little thought experiment. And I do think this is a fantastic question. And I want to come at it as looking for the root generator function of a cult. Speak to like, what can we speak to that? What do we know about that? And I want to do that. I want to set up the thought experiment in this model where there is no charlatans. There is no bad faith actors. This is a group of good-meaning, well-meaning people. Maybe you would point at that, Jamie, as anthropological, but I'm almost distilling it even more, like maybe a fantastic world where everybody actually is trying their best. So let's say we really, got a really good group of people together. Okay, so, and this is, I'm drawing on my experiences, Peter nodded to, of being able to participate in what I think was really close to that situation in the 80s in Northern California, that there was a very easy to identify with time and care, local community of well-meaning people and groups that were trying to do a lot of experiments back to land and culty-like things and the whole spectrum. So we got to see a lot of examples. And so this is what I kind of came up with as a very fast way to try to break this down. We can unpack this later if this is the direction people want to go. But basically, speaking to the fact that, again, the anthropological thing, people coordinate, they come together, it makes us powerful. I think we all get that. It's a thing we do. We have shared fictions. It's our superpower because we can make those reality by grounding them together. It's how we, just these amazing feats, go to the moon with some shared fiction. We did it. And so within a group, when we have to kind of do this quick change, we assign a captain, we assign status somehow. We decide we somehow know a pecking order. We know who's going to, in a flash, be the one we would follow. What's the mind? Because the coordination through communication, body language, everything takes so long, there's this huge investment in trying to establish who is going to be the one that we follow, to quickly, adjust. That can be a thing we do. And so we in a lived, shared by experience community, though it happened in natural systems, is that we would understand that lived experience, that tacit knowledge, that investment over time would be recognized, be intrinsically recognized. It'd be that respect for our elders. It would be just kind of, you just know, ask that guy, ask that girl, you just know. But we live in this modern world where we can, and now I'm kind of, even in good faith, I'm now bringing in the modern world where we often do that by a metric. We assign a metric instead as proxy. We collect people together that don't have that shared history. That's kind of the hallmark of modernity. And we assign these metrics to a context, and we assign that leadership to that metric. So we participate in a bunch of these Stranger Things metrics that we're very much introduced to in schools, the grading system, A through F, here's a metric, here's how you're pitted against your group, here's the people to follow. We're just used to signing up with metrics. We have these static metrics, and we're all on a hunt to try to find the groups where we can be at least a B player, hopefully, right? No one really wants to be C, D, E, F, so kind of jettison out of there. We maybe follow our talents, our passions. We believe in an investment model. We believe eventually we'll be recognized, maybe within a cohort, for that tacit knowledge to eventually become an A or B player. And this is kind of what we do. We hunt around for groups, in our modern world where we can have that status, and the person who's the leader gets all this protection, status, and rewards, and all the goodies. And we would hope in a naturally intelligent society that we would all get those eventually, because we would be by our very nature building that tacit knowledge as a virtue, by virtue of living. It's a side effect of living. It's an automatic thing. You automatically get it for free. And so, this would just kind of be how it would work. Here we kind of have to jockey for it, and we feel very betrayed when we aren't recognized for it, and yada, yada. So people are hunting for this. And so there's a seeker mentality of just that. And then there's a subset of seeker mentality that I would say everybody's vulnerable to, which is, what if there were a way to win all the games? What if there was a metric where you win 100% across the board, a global development model? any label or metric that would apply to the whole human as a whole, that you've holistically, independent of context, developed. Then you win. Then you win all the games. In theory, that's the dream, right? Right now, money is one of the proxies that you win a lot with money, but you can attach any of the labels and you can attach the anti-labels. So in interest of time, you could have rich people, beautiful people, authentic people, purified minds, bright minds, beautiful souls, smart people, intelligent people, wise people, evolved souls, good people, healthy people, on and on, meaningful people, wise people. You know, poor people, untouchables, crazy people, mentally ill people, bad people, evil people, monsters, idiots, unwashed masses, sheeple, people whose lives have no meaning, et cetera, as the ones you don't want to be, you know, kind of defining the category by its opposite. So if you basically, the cult mechanics, and I'm going to try to really wrap this up quickly, are that you just have to validate one of those metrics and have people believe in it, whether or not it's attainable, which most people tell you these things aren't. There's no evidence for any of those actually being true. That's not how it works. And a set of practices that lead towards it in a global context, which is also not true. And you couple those two things together, a global label with a global metric that's validated in someone's mind. And even if they do not have a leader, they will find one, they'll make one. That's the Tommy story, that's the life of Brian story. So basically you have, what do you have? The king top development in the real world is the only wisdom practice, which is applying your natural intelligence, restoring a state of health, which is very much what natural systems do. And we recognize it by virtue of its absence. So we recognize that we are sick and absent of it, and then we want to restore it. So we might find people that have restored it by means that are unclear. So we might actually find exemplars and then form even cults around them. I've seen this happen. I know these people. I've seen what they struggle with. So whether or not, you know, if everybody's good faith, if you've been anointed, appointed, found yourself bubbled up in the ranks of agreeing to the shared fiction, this is how we're measuring each other. And you're obviously the exemplar, the leader, the one we're going to give that status to, however you got it. That person who is often vilified, and, you know, for all the reasons, Jamie, you know, you can get this arrows projected at you, get all this power projected at you. You become, in a sense, this trapped queen bee, where you're just in this weird social dynamic where you're just fed and fed and fed, and that creates its own very strange dynamics. When you're trapped in that, the struggle of that person is to try to, if they're coming from a good faith place, serve the people that have done this to them, to disabuse them of the shared fiction, if they can, by restoring their own intrinsic abilities, which is the snarl that I kind of entered with, participating in people trying to untangle since the 80s, that I feel is still a major unsolved problem. And so my answer is wisdom practice frames still would fall victim to this dynamic as of today. I consider that unsolved. And I will pass it off to David. Dave.
I think one of the problems we got here is the debate within a US culture is different from a debate within a European or an African or a Australasian or Asian culture. And there's an old joke in Britain that we sent the religious fanatics to the States and the criminals to Australia, and we know who got the better deal. And Americans think it's a joke against Australians, and Australians think it's a joke against Americans. Actually, it's our version of sending out two ARC ships if we go back to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yeah. But religious form in the US is actually quite fascinating because it's very different. Yeah. It's definitely got a cult of leadership about it and a cult of a guru. So when Buddhism comes into the States, it ends up with the leader. I sometimes call that faux Buddhism. It's all about the guru, and the guru will lead you to enlightenment, and it's got cult-like aspects to it. Yeah, it's not that you don't get cults in other parts of the world, but it does seem to be unique to that particular spiritual tradition. Yeah, including the whole concept of the rapture, which is almost a US phenomenon. All right, and that's one of my criticisms, for example, of the religious wing of metamodernism. That actually it's creating its own version of the rapture. You can see it in the videos they produce and everything else. So you see that sort of form which comes through, and that I think is problematic. Yeah. I've also come across, I mean, the other area where you hit, there are three areas where you hit wisdom, I think. One is, and this is probably not relevant, we had a major problem with it in knowledge management days in the 90s. Because there are a whole group of people who decided they transformed beyond knowledge management and they were now into wisdom management. Yeah, and the rest of us could catch up. Yeah, and that was the sort of misuse of the data, information, knowledge, wisdom triad. and also the misuse of T.S. Eliot's favorite poem. And I remember once satirizing it by creating a 5-level triangle, which had eschatological realization as the next stage beyond wisdom management. And the depressing thing is that half the audience thought I was being serious. I'm still recovering from that, right, in terms of where it went. Yeah. But that sort of overlays, it's this concept that wisdom is some type of higher order level of being, which gives you authority over other people. I think that's where I have a real problem with it. And that's my objection to adult stage theory. I better not say what I was about to say then, right? But because what it ends up
say it, Dave, say it.
Okay, well, I'll go for it. All right. Yeah, a lot of the things you see with adult stage theory, and this is not my origination. I'd have to get permission to quote it on this one, but I love it. Right. And the statement was, the trouble is you've got a lot of young males who were very bright but bullied when they were school children. Then they come across adult development theory and it validates their history because now they discover they were a higher order of being and the rest of us should follow them. And there's an element of truth about that, right? It's the desire to be seen as the leader, to be wise, to have an extra level of enlightenment over everything else, which is a problem. I think you then get the cult issue, and I think I'd agree. I don't think anybody starts off with this or even continues into it in bad faith. Yeah, even when you're getting people to, swallow the Kool-Aid, you actually think you're doing the right thing. It's not evil per se, it's the intention is still good. And we're doing a lot of work at the moment on early stage misogynism and racism. And what you actually see there is people don't see that what they're doing has a negative effect. And because people don't push back on it, they do more of it and they don't get punished for it and they do more of it, then they come to believe it's a right. And I think that's what we see in the generation of cults. People start to say things, certain things get better hits. The internet makes this worse, or they get, everybody loves them for it, they get lots of likes. So they say more things like that. And then you get into this sort of downward spiral by which they become a cult, even though they didn't intend to be. Yeah, and they probably never realized they're at that point. So I'm very dubious about the whole idea of wisdom practices. I don't think you can engineer wisdom. I think wisdom in human systems is always retrospective. We recognize that somebody is wise after the fact. The idea you can create a system by which you will become wise, or you can create a program by which other people can become wise, I think disqualifies you straight away. And I think also it damages epistemic sovereignty. It prevents you actually understanding your own environment. I'd also say from an anthropological perspective, we really evolved, and this is picking up on Jamie, we really evolved to live in extended families and clans. Actually, tribes occasionally came together for ritual events, but most of the time you were in a clan or an extended family. And there were corrective facilities within that. I still remember a very famous example of this, a friend of mine in the Canadian Mounties said it. He said, every village used to have an idiot and it didn't matter because everybody knew who the idiot was. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy and make it a right. And I think that's one of the issues. In those smaller groups, you had self-corrective mechanisms which stop people getting above themselves. But on the internet, you don't get that. And there's this peculiar mixture. A friend of mine, Mark, is professor at Aberystwyth, has written a really good book on this lately on technology. He's pointing out there's a sort of very specific West Coast culture, which is a weird mixture of Ayn Rand libertarianism with, if everybody's connected, magically everything will work out. Yeah, and you can see that in Jim Rutt, you can see it in a lot of things in terms of the way things work together. So I think we got a problematic area. As I say, I'll come back to where I started, and I think wisdom is by definition always retrospective. Yeah, wisdom practices by default, you've just disqualified yourself from being wise by even promoting them. Wisdom signaling is the way that cults get started. Yeah, and I remember that I was a keynote at Peter Senge's conference in Vienna some years ago, And Sengi gave his keynote at the start, right? And he was introduced for about 15 minutes by somebody who basically told us all that Peter was, yeah, he made Mother Teresa look like some sort of devil worshipper who had to be converted. It was just sycophantic praise. And I was sat next to Marie de Groos, and I said, he's going to kill her, isn't he? Because it's almost like you're trained to do that as a keynote. If you get that sort of praise, you kill them because it's bad for you. And I remember he said he won't, wait and see what happens. And he commanded a minute's silence so we could appreciate what she said. All right. And he got it because people were appalled. Yeah. Now, it's not that Peter was deliberately trying to create that cult, but you get in these bubbles and it reinforces and reinforces. Then you come to believe it and nobody takes you down. So I think that's one of the problems with that. And coming back to the US point, I mean, if anybody hasn't read it, Neil Gaiman's American Gods is a brilliant book. Yeah, because all the gods that get taken to America become more extreme. If you actually read that book, that's one of the points, because they're an identity for a culture which has been displaced, but people have chosen to join a different culture in terms of the way it works. So I think we need to really avoid the sort of religious context of this, the sort of faux religious context of that. That's something very different. I think we need to recognize that wisdom is retrospective. I think we need to challenge people who exhibit the practices which might lead them into cult formation, because that's bad for them and it's bad for us. The book was Neil Gaiman's book, American Gods, which I think is one of his best works. Yeah, but make sure you get the author's version of it and don't look at the TV adaptation because that's terrible. Yeah. So at that point, I hand over to Bonita.
Thanks. I think that there's no real disagreement here, and I'm just going to try to put some bullets down from what I heard and where what is salient for me. So I love this introduction of the anthropology. I kind of heard both Jill and Dave tag onto that. And I had written that, you know, cult dynamics and tribal affiliations have been with us anthropologically forever, but they used to be constrained to certain types of relationships. That's something both Dave and Jill and Jamie talked about. So family or community or tribe. And from there, I started to think of how that it seems, and I'm going to be talking US, I suppose, given that definition that Dave had. But I think that as a society, we're particularly vulnerable to cult dynamics, and you see them everywhere. You know, if you watched the Netflix movie Nixvian, or even WeWork, it comes in organization and organizational science, and some of the most mundane place, NFTs, have a lot of cult dynamics in it. And so the question is, what is happening today that seems to position people to be particularly swept away by cult dynamics? So I just want to go through some of the cult dynamics that have been listed. So one of them is deception, and come for the wisdom, stay for the trauma laundering, right? And I think what's happening today is that see, I know you know. I think that what's happening today is not so much that, like in WeWork, maybe there was a financial deception, but there's a lot of self-deception going on in terms of how these cults maintain themselves as initiatives, and that's something to look at. And then the second, these are the 3Ds model of cult. The second one is dependence, so social, financial, and existential dependence. I think social dependence is completely exacerbated by the internet and gaslighting and social currency. But existential dependence, you know, we traffic in the meaning crisis, in the sense-making crisis, and all these belonging needs. I think there's a real existential hook today in terms of identity formation, and I think that leads to proclivity for cult dynamics. And then the third of the 3D is dread of leaving. And this is certainly a big social media dynamic outside of any kind of religious or cult or pseudoscience, gaslighting and canceling and, destroying severing all your relationships. This is a dynamic that we see in culture today. Then we have things like charismatic leadership. Dave talked about this maybe being a particularly US thing. I don't see a lot of that. I mean, I see a lot of nerdy people more than charismatic, unless it's the cult of Elon or something. Systems of influence, I think this is a big significant today because the web has this tendency for someone to show up and create this, what, like Jill said, this notion that there's a totalizing system, one-stop shopping. This system is going to fix all your problems. Then I think that then there's systems of control, behavioral manipulation, information, indoctrination, thought and emotion. Of course, all the algorithms are hacking our emotions. So I think those are often identified with cult dynamics. And I think we can just see that there's kind of like something that's occurring in modern life that has amplified them. Now, for me, what is important are two that I left out. And one is transcendent ideology, which I think is, it takes all this proclivity we have and really sharpens the needle, I think, on what is at stake here. So we could talk about transcendent ideologies. And this is highly associated with the use of psychotechnologies, which always makes people vulnerable to cult dynamics. And so there's a real ethical component. And these are not only psychedelics and psychotropics, but also simple things like the coordinated movement of bodies in space through chanting and ecstatic dancing is extremely powerful. And then it gets attached to a transcendent ideology versus it says, hey, you know what? Just go and coordinate your bodies in space. You guys will get like ecstatic. But those experiences, which are rare in the upbringing of most people, then get attached to this transcendent ideology. And that's the hook. And the other one that really bothers me is called negation or deconstruction. So we problemize the self, we problemize the family, we problemize conventional norms, we problemize, you kind of take away all the conventional grounding that can enable people to observe cult-like dynamics from a place of stability. I think that one's important to talk about. So I'm just going to end that, at the Consilience Conference, I talked about iatrogenic soteriology. So when soteriology means when you try to save people. And I think when these wisdom practices pretend or set themselves up. So on this side, you have the people are diseased and damned. And on this side, you have people who are well, healthy, and saved. Right, so that's a soteriological formula that we're going to save these people. So this is where all the good intentions come in. But I think that just like in medicine, and Ivan Ilyich in medicine, in education, in the economy, there's a certain inflection point where trying to do something good has more harm than benefit. And so if we could look at what that inflection point is, some of which I think you've all kind of pointed out is important as a community. What is the inflection point when what we're trying to do to help does more harm than good? And I would say just having this attitude of trying to save people is itself problematic. So yeah, I thought I would just throw it out to us to also talk about what do we think is at stake here? Like, what's really at stake here? Like, do I really care that WeWork was a cult or people lost money in NFTs? Well, kind of. It embarrasses me about humans sometimes. But yeah, what's really at stake here is what I'd really like to hear you all speak to.
I would like to, I'm happy if you'll want to speak to that. I'm also interested in this unpacking more about this attitude to try to save people, if that's problematic. Also, there's two claims that are made in everyone's speaking that maybe I don't completely agree with, or feel like there's more nuance there. And the idea that anyone can globally claim helping people get wiser would be problematic. So I think there's kind of two kind of global and also totalizing systems. So there's kind of three claims maybe I heard for kind of global principles or something that are thrown on the table. That would be interesting for me to explore deeper. And I threw my own out as well as the generator function being solely tied to the transcend, what I think you're calling transcendent ideology, an ungroundable global stage theory, stage model concept.
I think picking up on that, it's not just a desire to save people, it's desire to condemn other people. So yeah, the influence of Manichaeism on Western thought is huge, because Manichaeism threads through Augustine. Augustine picks up on St. Paul on that. That goes into Calvin, and you can see that as a really strong tendency. And you see it heavily these days in politics, in which there's the saved and there's the damned, right? So everything has to be that sort of dichotomy in that sense. And I think that's problematic. It's why I've always disliked Neoplatonism, because I think it gives rise to that, because it has the elite who are not chained to the floor of the cave, who can guide people to guidance and all those sort of things, right? So there are sort of warning signs on that. Chris Kavanagh actually came up with 4 warning signs, I thought, on the preview, the one we were all asked to look for in advance. And I think these are sort of red flag areas. So he talked about metaphor-filled soliloquies. Yeah. The minute people start to do that, you know you've got a problem. Wallowing in grievance, so condemning other people but being a victim. Yeah. Narcissistic self-regard, and then this whole concept of crisis of meaning and metacrisis. I mean, that's been the case for thousands of years in humans. It's not that we don't have a polycrisis, we have a polycrisis at the moment. But trying to gaslight people into your religion by creating a crisis of meaning has a long history in humans, right? And I think I just have an allergic reaction the minute I see any of those, right?
Can you say the first one again, Dave?
Sorry?
What was, can you say the first one again?
Metaphor-filled soliloquies. I thought that was a lovely expression. Because the thing about metaphors is you can say things that everybody wants to hear without really saying anything. Yeah, it's an old debating trick, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff in rhetoric, and you can use that negatively. I mean, if I don't like appreciative inquiry people, I remind them of the final scene of Monty Python's Life of Brian, and that's a completely unfair argument, but it actually it shuts them up, right? So that use of metaphors to control people is an old trick of rhetoric. You get taught it. But when it's used almost unconsciously to gaslight people into accepting that you are wise, that's what worries me. Yeah. And as I say, my point is appearing to be wise to an audience is addictive. And the internet actually feeds you that continuously if you exclude yourself from criticism. Yeah.
That reminds me, I went to Catholic school, so it was taught by Xaverian brothers, and in my Latin class there was a quote from Ovid above the chalkboard, and it was in Latin, but we had to transcribe it, and it said who, looking down on 20 or 30 upturned shining faces, doesn't say more than he knows, and then just injected into the social media phase. It's that on steroids. Yeah.
I'll tag on something Jill said, and I don't know how you phrased it, so hopefully this will stick with the meaning. And that was something like, you can't teach wisdom directly. You know, I mean, I don't think you can be a wisdom teacher, and Dave said the same thing. The metaphor I use is that years ago, you could be a doctor and become a wise person over time, because you had a career, a devotion, a vocation, you stayed with the community, you saw people grow and develop, you birthed babies, you put people, you know, help people when they died. And over time, this career could make you a wise person. Now, if you're a doctor today, it's not structured to make you a wise person. It's all standardized to the, you know, the data. And same thing with education. Years ago, you could be a teacher and you could be devoted to that vocation. And over time, or a gardener, or a, you know, master gardener, or a musician. And over time, because of your participation in worldly things, you know, the world is stubborn. It's not going to appeal to your metaphors. It's not going to appeal to what you can imagine is real. But if you are intimate with a vocation in the world, over time, it'll make you wise. But teachers today, same thing. It's not structured career to make you wise. And the last thing we need are wisdom teachers whose careers aren't structured to make you wise. In fact, it's not a career like that. It is the quality of some other type of pursuit over time. And so, like, one of the things I think is, if you're interested in creating a wise society, you have to change, you know, it's ontological design. You have to change people's long-term experience in that society.
You made a really important point there. If you look at your example of the doctor who got to know people and did things, wisdom is an emergent property of expertise within a community. Yeah, it's something which was acquired. It was and this concept of emergent property is key, and the outcome focus is a real issue. So we had an English teacher who was also a headmaster. Yeah, he got straight A's from all his pupils. He never had a learning plan or a lesson plan in his life. He used to turn up and he just used to teach on the hoof. He could quote Shakespeare verbatim from virtually every play, and he inspired everybody to learn, and he got brilliant results. He would not survive in a modern education environment. Yeah, because, and what happened, and it really came in sort of 80s and 90s with the, and I blame systems thinking for this, because it brought in the engineering metaphor and the concept that you have to define the output of everything in order to control uncertainty. Now, what complexity does is it says you focus on the input, not the output. All right, that's the big switch, because if you do lots of small things at a hyperlocal level, then you will get emergent properties that you can reinforce or disrupt. But if you start by the idea you have to design the output, you've got a problem. And I think what most of the people in the guru status are doing, yeah, they're not, and I emphasize, I don't think they start off like this, is they're trying to define the future state. Yeah, they're trying to define the rapture because they have the knowledge and they will tell you what that is. And that's actually what gains currency.
Can we explore that a bit? Because to me, that is one of the most fascinating things about cultic dynamics. And Dave, you've mentioned it a couple of times, which is you sort of believe in the good faith starting conditions. And I think, Jill, you might even mention something comparable. Let's assume that people are trying to kind of do the right thing. And I've just been fascinated by some form of teacher who shows up with early signs of crystal insight and then gets bent over time. And what is that bending over time? Because in a lot of cult conversations, and whether that's Chris Kavanaugh and Matt and those guys, or whether it's the conspirituality guys, that, you know, or everything that preceded those podcasts, there's a bit of sort of pearl clutching sort of moralism in the cult deprogramming space, right? They're very unilateral, and it's almost just swap. It's like AA. You're just swapping one dependency for another in the cult deprogramming process. But there's very little curiosity into what did those folks have going on. Like you take a Trungpa, you take an Adida, you take some of these people that, by all accounts of the people around and near them in the moment, there was some very pronounced field effect, and it wasn't, it wasn't simply placebo. And yet, being at the center of that, you ended up in sort of Lord Acton 101. And, in recent brain scan studies on people with power showing how it decreases empathy, degrades, interrelationship, self-responsibility. The Jungian psychologist, Robert Johnson had that notion of the golden shadow, that we project onto the people we idolize, or, as possessing all the traits and capacities we couldn't possibly, and then that's a potential toxin in the system. So I'm just curious what you all think about, how is it that potentially worthwhile movements, teachers, philosophies, whatever, get corrupted, polluted, tainted over time, and what do you see as the either drivers of that so we can be aware of them, or the interventions that would prevent that going forward?
I'd like to cycle back. That was kind of what I was trying to lay out, probably way too fast ahead of time, is exactly that mechanism, because there's one group in particular that was exactly Life of Brian. It was uncanny what happened to this fellow. It was very funny. It was equally comical. He's always insulting his followers, running from them. I don't want to be your guru. And they're like, aha, that's hilarious. And I've seen real life, good faith Life of Brian on play, and I know those people. They're still friends with those people. It has its own lovely qualities, which I'm not going to go into right now. But so I really do want to uphold kind of this giving a lot of respect's due, in a sense. I think that's probably my position against all these, that I do want to still hold something. There's something of value there. I think that I also have been intimately involved with one of the worst cults ever, as one of our nearest neighbors, that we would get their offshoot people into our group showing up all the time that were extremely traumatized. It's there's been recent even podcasts about their abuses, and I know their fellows for decades now, and even the people who have been most severely abused I've spoken to about a lot of the cults will also not concede that there wasn't value. There's still value. There's still value in the experience. So, but I feel like what's missing in this conversation, I want to add a couple things I feel like I want to add that are missing. And you can reject this if you want, but this was based on my own conclusion, having researched the academic tact on wisdom and what's known and what's been studied and measured. Is that first off, it attaches very well as a verb, as a doing. It's a sense-making move, and it can be turned on in minutes. If you want to, there's metrics. There are metrics that exist with objective encoders. This is the work of Staudinger and Baltes that show a standard deviation increase in this metric if you give people time alone, solitary reflection. So it's a sense-making retrospective, like you said, Dave. And that if you look at longitudinal studies, work of Monica Ardelt, working with people in depression and different cohorts, you see that a lot of patterns emerge, which are basically the rough sketches. If you had a lot of life adversities, a lot of stressors in your life, positive or negative, you have a possibility of measuring higher in wisdom at the end of your life. If they're positive, you're likely going to win. If they're negative, it depends. It arcs on how much sense making you did somewhere in the middle of your life. So basically, life comes at you. There's an active verbing doing of sense making. The result, the being of it, coming back, having a sense that someone has made sense of something. That's a sense we have that we would call like a wise signal, and then the accumulation of it, that is hard to find, other than tied to your direct experiences of whether or not you are kind of lost in the chaos and not able to make sense of your life, or you were able to make sense of your life. So everyone kind of gets the same set of life experiences. You max out at having made sense of those life experiences. And then if you jump to the memoir writers, another data point is that they kind of anecdotally say, if you really want to offer something of value, wait 10 or 20 years before you write your memoirs. So there's kind of this other lag kind of considered of like that you get more value if you get even more time behind you to somehow, conceptually blend whatever happened in your past with your lived experience moving forward. Now you get a natural transcendent move because they're out of that context. So the transcendent move that we recognize as wisdom is emergent from maybe a multi-perspectival first person perspective in your life, where you get enough perspectives and you kind of end up in a transcendent view. You sound transcendent, you don't sound embedded, you sound like you can maintain a clear view on your life. So you know, in that sense, what that really reveals is that there's a doing, there's a verbing, there is an activity of sense making. It is what we intrinsically do. So how do you satisfy that paradox? And the way we frame the problem, we tie wisdom to natural intelligence, to cognition, to life, to lived experience, to first person perspective, to context. All these things are kind of synonymous of what we're doing. And so the problem really becomes, when do we stop doing that? And that gets back to the generator function of when are we not, when is that capacity blocked and how is it blocked? And so that's where I'm going to stop here in a minute, but I would throw out that everything that Bonita listed as the more outrageous cult dynamics can happen anywhere. They're just a larger form, downstream manifestation of having that ability blocked, and then what comes of it. So capturing someone's attention. I also, I'm not going to quite stop there. I recommend the Sarah Lawrence cult special, the last episode. You don't want to watch the whole thing, because they have actually someone who is an Ivy League trained psychiatrist who ended up in a cult of 3, deeply brainwashed, with another person who's deeply brainwashed, and then the interviews with her afterwards describing the direct experience of trying to get out of that cult of 3 or 4 people, literally. So how did that happen? And that really supports the fact that the person who pulled off that cult, you watch his dynamics, he had very much mastered what you can learn about if you learn about false memories, or learn about getting people to confess to crimes they didn't commit. How do you mess with autobiographical memory and capture people's attention and set up these dynamics? So these same dynamics that happens in basically can exist in groups. And if you put that together, you get the crazy, you know, mind control, slave, give your life savings away, do anything for a person thing. So I'd say that that's how I'd kind of wire that into the cognitive science. And so that cults are just a special case of a lot of that around a unattainable, ungroundable, you know, and the way you block it is something ungroundable. And that ties back to these unattainable, transcendent ideologies that aren't attained directly, that happen indirectly.
There's a key phrase you use there, which is ungroundable.
Yeah.
And I think that comes back to something I said up front. We used to live in a physical environment where there were enough feedback loops that certain levels of insanity couldn't happen. Yeah. And we know that. So if you get less conflict if people are physically together in a room. And we know that, for example, olfactory sense is linked to trust, and you don't get that in a virtual environment. Yeah. So what virtual environments have allowed people to do is to cluster in more and more levels of isolation. And we know that gives rise to cults, always. Yeah. The other interesting thing, we've done a lot of work on mental breakdown. And what we found in blue light services, British phrase for police, ambulance, etc., is the main cause of mental breakdown is the safety rules, not the job. Yeah, which is really interesting, because the safety rules are done retrospectively based on a normal distribution. This is the problem with all rule-based systems. They assume a normal distribution, a Gaussian distribution. The reality of people's lives is in the tails of a Pareto distribution. So actually, you have to break the rules to do the job. And you can see this in health, you can see it in police, you can see it in education. If you actually do a good job, you will end up breaking the rules, because the rules have been devised without that connection with reality. Yeah. Now, I think that also, and I speak as a Catholic here, right? I need to be careful, but I'm also a Catholic convert, which is more dangerous, right? But the minute religions focus on transcendence, you have a problem anyway. This is the faith we works debate, right? The minute you say you're justified by faith alone, and you can see this in this really strong Protestant tradition around cults in the States, you can see its inheritance from that tradition. It is justification by faith alone. It's sole fide. Yeah, and you will now be disconnected from your family, from reality, from doing things in that community, and that way we can control you. Yeah. And the control is done for your salvation. That's what's scary about it. It's not done with evil intent. It's done so that you can be saved, right? And you see this in films. I mean, if you watch Damien, the movie, right, which is a terrifying movie, Because if you catch somebody trying to stab somebody with ritual daggers, you're going to take them away. You don't know they're the devil. I mean, go back to that movie and see the sort of suspension of belief type thing that you see in that. Yeah. And that perpetuates in popular culture. But I think I really want to emphasize this. I think if people actually have to live in a community and they get overwhelmingly arrogant or cult-like, somebody will take them down in that community with jocular humor or their work or whatever. We've done a lot of work, literally taking executives from one company and making them servants in another company. You can't make them servants in their own company because they know it. But I took the board of Tesco and made them counter clerks in the bank, and I took the board of the bank and made them vegetable stackers in the supermarket for a week. And that was an extremely effective intervention because it forced them to see themselves in a different perspective. We didn't lecture them, we put them in a position where they had to see the world differently. Now, communities always did that with people, but the internet doesn't. It allows you to isolate yourself in such a way that you get the wrong sort of reinforcement.
Dave, can you just unpack the Gauss versus Pareto? I thought that was a really interesting insight, and would like
Okay,
to
so if you look at what actually happens when people develop rules, they look at a whole series of incidences, all right, and they end up drawing a bell curve. Yeah, all God's children love bell curves because then you can eliminate the outliers. Yeah, and then you can say this rule applies 99.9% of the time. The trouble is, if you do a double log scale of any natural phenomenon, which includes human behavior, you get a power law, which actually translates as a Pareto distribution, which is a fat tail. So you've just excluded virtually everything which is going to happen in people's day-to-day lives. Okay? And you can't have rules and outcome measures in the tails of a Pareto distribution. You have to have a process. So to illustrate that, one of the things we're starting to do in the health service is we're defining combinations of 3 roles, that rule of 3 again, who can make decisions without actually not based on rules. Because you can't actually settle rules for that sort of outlier, but you have to have a process by which decisions are made, and the process has to be transparent. You don't make it an individual. And I would say that was the other thing, is the total focus on the individual is also a nightmarish problem here. And that's a North Atlantic problem. And I refuse to call it Western. It isn't Western, it's North Atlantic. It's Northern Europe, North America. It's nowhere else in the world. If you look at the work we're doing with indigenous groups in Australia, you're integrated with your community and with the land. All right. And that's actually been the case for most of human history, and we just lost it.
It's a paradox, though, and in there, because I'm agreeing with you, but then I'm seeing it a paradox because there is a hyper focus on the individual in terms of the transcendent language and salvation and stuff, but there are also a background of mass reality distortion psychotechnologies that makes kind of a mass consciousness, right? So there's like, you don't get highly individuated people walking out of cult dynamics. You get, they abdicate, they cede their consciousness to something else. So what is that? What is that paradox? The people are always saying in the US is a mass, focus on the individual. And yet it's just, and yet there's so much acquiescence and ceding of one's own opinion. So how do you reconcile those two things? I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that it needs clarification. Yeah.
To throw something else in the question, one of the things when we were working on counterterrorism in DARPA, right? One of the things which came out of that is America then was monocultural. I'd say it's now duocultural, but multi-ethnic, because people chose to be American. Whereas most people in Europe, Africa, and Asia didn't make a choice to go somewhere, right? And to become something different. And I think that actually has had an impact, because it's this desire to reach the promised land, yeah? And you can see that sort of feeding over into culture downstream. Now, that's a very crude and high-level summary, but that's kind of like the way it works. And as somebody just pointed, a whole bunch of people were brought in as slaves and they made no choice on that. But the dominant culture comes from the people who chose to do it, not the people who were involuntarily transported to it.
Yeah, Dave, you've continued to mention the uniquely weird nature of American culture, you know, going back centuries. And just for folks that are, you know, here and listening, Kurt Anderson's book Fantasyland: How America Went Haywire is a wonderful sort of 500 years, starting with the crazy Puritans. It's just batshit bananas from the beginning, and we're only living in the silicon chip, you know, amplification of that. And then the other one, speaking of rapture ideologies and kind of their pernicious impact, the moment you have a transcendent outcome, you know, that we can get to from here. John Gray's book, I think it's at the London School of Economics, but he wrote a book called Black Mass, Apocalyptic Religion and the Death of Utopia. And he just unpacks, he was even using it as a critique of like neocons in the Gulf War, but then goes back and acknowledges communism being, you know, just Christianity without the God, and all of these kind of hockey stick moves that we bypass reality, relationship, responsibility, place, kinship, all of those things, and just how seductive those are. And Bonita, you mentioned NFTs.
At the moment,
say that again.
So one of the great ironies at the moment is Putin is doing the same thing with the concept of Rus.
Yeah.
He's doing exactly the same thing. The concept of Rus, which is the ideology driving what's happening in Ukraine and would have driven what happened elsewhere, is adopting that same model, which historically wasn't there. Yeah. Historically, the model protected.
And you know, and NFTs and AI and Neuralink and you name it, even on the Silicon Valley side, old blinky shiny, not religious at all, are all aping those same deep structures. And that's, I think, part of why they feel so truthy and why they feel so compelling to so many. It's like, yes, 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 and tell us where the happy land is and describe it for us and tell us how we're going to get there. And it's just an incredibly deep narrative structure in, as you're describing it, the North Atlantic.
There's another really interesting book called Fire and Ice, if you've read it. It's called Fire and Ice. It's a description of the difference between Canadian and American culture. And it's a really interesting book. I mean, it's about 10 or 20 years out of date, but it's fascinating.
I want to chime in also that there's a measurable difference in wisdom between cultures, and America doesn't fare well. And I want to make one last pitch. I know we're going to close this down in a minute, that I think we have to acknowledge that there are successful transcendent, I believe successful transcendent non-culty experiments happening right now in the form of the technical meditators that are going into very exotic states using measurable in a lab, highly contextualized as a doing. So it's like this particular activity. It's like an inner sport of insight where you can put your attention here and put your attention there. Then this happens, this happens, this happens. People are doing this by following each other's books. I'm specifically talking about the initiative like Daniel Ingram and Frank Yang and I'm totally blanking on the Roger Tisdale. So these are people that are deciding to take on this enterprise of trying to go after exotic states, the state chasing problem, and are doing it outside the confines of a lot of these dynamics. And there are complications, but they're also trying to address the complications. So I think that there's another dimension to this. It's not, we can't just completely throw out transcendence as being untenable. I think there might be emergent models where people can, if that's what they're interested in, that's what they're drawn to do, that's what they're curious about, pursue these things outside of a lot of the trappings. Again, they have their own complications, but I think it's like a different container. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
Yeah, I think that's a whole other ball of wax. And while I agree with you that these experiences are rare, real and non-ordinary, I think they all can be easily and have been easily traced to the continuity of ordinary experience. And this has been proven by neuroscience and by the other advanced meditators, Shinzen Young, Lee Brazington, Robert Bea. They all are clearly say these are just amplified versions, you know, and what it is, it depends on what's online and what's offline. So if you're playing sports and you do this amazing thing on the basketball court, or you're Joe Montana who says, when I'm at my best, I don't even know what I'm doing. That's a flow state. So what's offline is the self structure. Is that a transcendent? Well, when you use that word, it sounds like it's not available to ordinary human experience. And all of these things are available to naturalized ordinary human experience. And so this is what I'm saying. These words make it sound like, oh, on this side are people that have transcended, or the life, space and time, and mere mortals and men. And so I have a very strong objection to tagging those experiences to the word transcendence. Now we can talk about what that word might mean, but I think that's not important here. Anyways, I just wanted to, so
and just to pick up another point, I said wisdom is always retrospective, but we recognize wisdom. That doesn't mean we can define it. There's a whole body of human qualities where we have a name for something which we can recognize, but we can't define in a way that somebody could then acquire that skill. That's a sort of different interpretation. The other thing, I think, if you look at teaching and you look at virtue ethics, there's a sort of movement to rediscover Aristotelian virtue ethics at the moment, because that means you don't teach people to wise, but you teach people. Teaching is part of making people virtuous. You can't abandon teaching in any society. We've never not had a mechanism by which people are taught with different methods. Yeah. But that concept of virtue ethics is something which McIntyre and others have been trying to bring back in as a way in which you change the view of education to something which creates qualities, but not to create explicit criteria. And I think that difference between qualities and explicit criteria is part of what we're talking about here.
That's one of my criticism of the Socrates film, and that is when Socrates, Socrates had a different kind of mind. It knew it could think with thoughts. And so instead of telling stories around the courageous person, they put the word courage and they say, what is that? So they're trying to define something completely out of context. And words, when they're isolated, they don't mean anything, just like facts when they're isolated in science. They have no meaning. And so this move to say, what is wisdom? Or to have some data markers around, it's not that kind of thing. It's not. And so I'm totally agreeing with you on that move to like define something which is indefinable because it only has meaning inside the context. And now as people, that context can go out to the whole universe, but we have to stop somewhere, right? But certainly trying to stop at the word or a definition is it's something that the analytic reductionist philosophers in the UK and the US discovered a long time ago. It's not possible.
I want to nod to both of those and say that the wisdom research I'm referring to is based on inter-rater reliability, that when you use a word, people agree that they witness it in the unstructured writing responses. So you're using a human measure. You are conceding that point and saying the fact that everybody seems to agree on this word, everybody reads a passage and can agree that that word applies to this passage, is how they are doing that science. So it isn't so much of this extrinsic, how do you measure? They kind of bypass that and say, here's a thing we all agree is a thing. Can we show everyone agrees it's the same thing? And it's because everybody agrees. So that's what you're looking at when you're looking at something is changing the needle on what we all recognize by a standard deviation. And that is a solitary time. So you can start to unpack the mechanics of this without having to define it as such. So
yeah, and we're getting into the minutiae, and Peter's calling me calling me to call him in so we can get to Q&A, I suppose. So yeah, Peter.
Right. Thank you, Bonita, and thank you, Jamie, Jill, Dave. A lot of interesting and engaging threads have opened up. And let there be light in the Stoa. You can turn back, you can turn your camera back on, and then we'll have a question or two. Alexander Bard, I know you're here and you had a question coming in. Would you like to or share perhaps. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask a
Hello there.
question?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
That's better, right? You can hear me now.
Yep.
Good, good, good. Yeah, this was a fascinating conversation. I just had a chat with Peter earlier today, and the whole conversation has taken over a completely different direction, probably thanks to Dave's fantastic critique of American discourse. But one thing we were talking about, Peter and I today, is that besides the fact that to avoid having a cult leader, make sure you have at least 3 leaders. Power sharing is actually the key to that. Or if you want to figure out whether a person is a cult leader, go and have a dinner with them. If he's surrounded by nothing but yay sirs, then he's a cult leader. If he's surrounded by people who's perfectly happy to take critique from, he's not. So there are some sort of basic advice to that. But the problem with this is also that to achieve any sort of wisdom, we have to have people also isolated in retraction. That's why we build monasteries and we go to retreats and we take time off to consolidate ourselves and integrate our experiences. And in this realm, there's actually something very feminine and beautiful about it that I just like to drop here. In the tech world, it's called having an incubator. An incubator is actually literally a sort of womb for a new culture to develop, which has to be protected from the outside. It has to have a really strong, thick membrane. And therefore, it probably looks like a cult. You think about it, like having an incubator. But actually, the pointer is that a cult is meant to last forever, whereas an incubator or something is only meant to last until it can dissolve itself and walk out into the public and walk out into the commons. And there, it can add enormous value. And there's a beautiful word I just like to drop in here, not having too many words in the conversation. It's a word of cephalization, if you've heard of cephalization before. What life forms naturally do is that what's most valuable to life form will naturally find a very protective space. The way I talk about immense work is like you probably appreciate your brain and your dick the most and look at where they're located on your body. Hopefully they're located in sort of protected spaces. As a joke, but cephalization, the point with cephalization is that something that's really truly valuable will be isolated and cared for within a life form. It's like the life form will know that, okay, first thing you learn in the life form, if you have a memory, is that you learn that what's most valuable to be protected. And precisely because it is protected, it also has the possibility to drift off and go off and become its own thing. And that's exactly how you work with incubators when you do technological development, is that you isolate somebody, you retract them from the world for a specific given time, and then you see if they're ready to go outside in the outside world yet, and then you cephalize them. You literally give birth to a new life form that then goes out on its own, and then it can thrive in the sort of commons world, which is of course a world of enormous competition and things like that. So I just like to drop that into the overall conversation, that I think it's very, very important to discuss the idea of cults and commons and put this concept along a timeline. And for me, cult is rather an incubator with a possibility to cephalize a new life form if you have it as a retracted place for a period of time until it goes out in the world as a new life form is being born. Whereas a cult is basically isolate yourself from the outside world, forget about being part of the commons, and then try to, within that cult, thrive for as long as you can, usually then waiting for a comet to come along so everybody can kill themselves or something like that. The suicide cults do. And I think it's very, very important to make a distinction here because, between the possibility of an incubator and actually moving into a cult. Hope that makes sense.
But I think that the complication with that frame is you have to accommodate experts by experience, which are real things, which we talked about in the proper functioning system. You have accumulated tacit knowledge, you have lived experience. You wouldn't distribute power of people, between children and elders, right? The elders, you wouldn't be making decisions on behalf of the children. If there's one, that's the person who gets the power. So I think we organically would distribute the power attached to the experts by experience, lived experience that we would know by being embedded. So this to me feels like another disembodied configuration, and will suffer from all the same problems there because you cannot ground. You have to ground through people, and you have to ground through people's direct experience. So if you can't have a system that mirrors that somehow and acknowledge that and starts to build into that, you'll still end up in this crazy dynamic, and probably people will still be jockeying for control regardless, as happens.
Just a comment directly on that. There's a word for that, mentorship. And mentors are everywhere in the incubator world. It's like the first thing you need is not money if you're a young guy or a girl and you start a company, but rather you need mentorships. And they're dying to mentors everywhere. And mentors then represent wisdom. And there are two kinds of mentors. If you can't afford the really global mentor, like a person with real wisdom of the entire enterprise and maybe great understanding of humanity, like a favorite professor or something like that, but you go for a local mentor. Local mentor at least as the expert on what you're trying to achieve. And then probably as you expand, you can probably then increase the wisdom of the overall organization. So mentorship is one way by avoiding that. The other one is the classic way to avoid tyranny at all. Tyranny seems to always be somebody who tries to be both transcendent, which is entrepreneurial in the world I'm talking about here, be the wisdom in terms of having the knowledge, like I know everything, I'm the expert of knowledge here, I'm knowledgeable. And the third one, which is actually often forgotten, which is the possibility of reproduction, like this has been done before in history, there's a possibility to reproduce this over again. And reproduction principle and the transcendence principle and the knowledge principle are three very different ones. The tragedy is when they're mistaken for being one, which is Nietzsche did with his will to power. The argument against will to power is that he's talking about three very different things. And the way to avoid tyranny is just to point out within an organization that we have at least three leaders representing the three different kinds of a direction that leadership has, which is how you avoid tyranny. It's the beauty of the US Constitution, power splitting. Split the power from day one before you construct something, and you can avoid the cult leader as well. And of course, mentorship. Mentorship is the word in incubator culture, which you're asking.
Now that worked really well for the Romans post the death of Caesar, didn't it?
I'd say these are necessary and insufficient conditions. There's many more conditions you need to avoid cults, but this would be indicative of one of many things you would need.
There's a great little book by Bill Hamilton called Saints and Psychopaths that people might, which is it's his own story, his own journey between trying to discern the difference in basically Western Buddhist cult culture.
Can you post the link to that, Bonnie?
I would say that the way that experiment was laid out was very much what we were trying to do in the 80s. Even to the degree of the group I ended up joining, we considered like a PhD program. You should graduate within about 4 years of effort. You're basically trying to learn this deconstructive moves of the trapped attention, everything we talk about today, to ground into your life. There was no direct practices. There's no wisdom practices. It was just a collection of people attempting to learn the cognitive moves to do this. And it was understood when you're done, you're off to do your real work, which is to get back to living, and you should never leave your current context to do this work. So it's a bit of slippery, challenging, tricky path to try to solve the American problem. And it was openly trying to solve it, continues to try to solve it. So I think there are groups that are trying to be very clever about this already. And I think that these are not bad ideas, but there's lots of great failure modes to go look for. And what I've actually wanted was to start a really intense forum of all the people that are hiding in the woods right now in their 60s, 70s, 80s that have done these experiments as a base to run these ideas past, because so many experiments have been done that sound like this, and you can identify the failure modes. I think that would be a wise, less foolish way forward to try to get at what people want, right? We want to invent a new culture. We don't want this. We want something else. What do we do? We're stuck, right?
I think I'm just playing with the idea, maybe I'm a devil's advocate here, because I totally agree, but I'm playing with the idea that there are limits to the cult of transparency. For all the goodness the cult of transparency gave us, for Christianity, for the liberal democracy. I lived and worked in India in the 1990s, and people got little microphones and little cameras and could finally expose corruption. And the tremendous quality that has added to Indian culture over the last 30 years is just really, really impressive. So the cult of transparency that Christianity and Islam fostered on us enabled us in the West to entangle us from the caste system, which has been the curse of the East ever since. Right? This is the greatest achievement, I think, of Western culture. I'm all for the call to transparency. I want to say that. I'm a big defender of it. But I'm just playing with the idea that when is it defensible to not go for the call to transparency? And I would say that would have to be at the beginning of a curve or something, when it sort of has to grow before we can let it out in the open. And that should be considered. That's all I'm saying.
I don't think we escaped the caste system in the West. I think we have a different type of caste system, and it's epigenetically inclined to privilege the children of rich kids. All right.
Yeah, Dave, but if I sit down and talk to people that do, yeah, sorry. If I sit down
it's a caste.
Okay, when I sit down and talk to people in Bangalore today, doing technology so they can finally get out of the caste system and marry a person they love, rather than having to go into arranged marriages and every shit the caste systems bring with them. There's certainly a difference here. Even if it's a class system, it's better than caste. Right?
I've worked in Chennai, I've worked in Mumbai, I know that's a difference. I'm just trying to point out that there are caste systems in the West which are as exclusory, but they're less explicit, therefore they're more difficult to challenge. And it's not that simplistic.
No, I'm not saying that either, and it's getting worse in the West. But for Christianity and Islam, and I was talking about the call to transparency, where it comes from. The call to transparency has enormous advantages, but it is dominating the Western culture for good or bad. And I was just talking about when it's defensible to actually not go for transparency. That's all it's doing.
I just don't think I've seen a cult of transparency in Islam or Christianity. I see a cult of privilege, and I'm actually a Christian, but I still see a cult of privilege. I think it's
okay. It's fundamental.
You're creating dichotomies here, and dichotomies are really.
Can you listen to the argument, Dave? The argument is simple: all equal before God is radically different from paganism. That's all there's to it.
Okay. And one of the other characteristics of a cult leader is when you disagree with them, they say, "Would you please listen to my argument?" All right. I was listening to your argument. I disagree with you. I think you're creating dichotomies which are unnecessary.
I'm going to do a timeout here. I think this is going to be a third session at the Stoa, Wisdom Incubators versus Wisdom Commons. But thank you, Alexander. We'll definitely circle back for another session. And just to maybe take in a couple more questions from the chat. Charles, you had a question. If you can unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks everyone. Well, I had two questions. I guess I'll go just anything more on the Wisdom Commons itself. I think, Dave, you addressed a bit the question of, I mean, short of defining, just sort of converging on shared meaning around the term wisdom. But yeah, just moving beyond identifying, navigating the anti-patterns, which has been pretty much the whole session, I think. Unless I missed something, I would love to hear anything about the positive patterns of Wisdom Commons. Thanks.
Quaker.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Jill.
Oh, Quaker. Quaker communities. That's what I'm throwing into the ring. People can try to shoot that one down, but I think that's the best example I've seen is an attempt to do Wisdom Commons. Yeah. Maybe, you know, the successful ones. So I've heard that it's gone different directions, but as I imagine the good ones, I've never participated in one, but as I see what they're trying to attempt, they seem like a special category.
Yeah, I mean, we've spent quite a bit of time, I think you're right, on sort of quote unquote failure modes, as if we're doing it wrong, and then additional correctives or rules or regulations will then fix it so we could do it right. And I think the biggest insight, and I have no idea, you know, whether other people would agree with this, but the one that came to me in writing that book, Recapture the Rapture, and a whole section on ethical cult building, like how on earth do we do this thing halfway decently, was a realization of like, oh, maybe all of these cultic dynamics, especially the sort of sage on the stage, the deference to a leader, all that kind of stuff, maybe they're a feature, not a bug. Maybe that's actually inevitable when you get primates together to do the things we do together. And so rather than seeing those as examples of failure mode, rather, how do we actually design inputs, to Dave's point, not outputs, that help address that inevitable arising of those dynamics? So one is, can you, fundamentally, can you open source techniques of ecstasy? So everybody has a chance to contact the transcendent, the numinous, whatever it might be that you're hanging your hat on collectively. can you have ritualized, basically a returning of the golden shadow, right? So it's not about it's not about the Hierophant or the psychopomp. It's not about the one up front connecting the circuits. It's about each individual. And one of the simplest ways to do that would be rotational leadership responsibility. So like one example would be is if you had some ecstatic service and you could do dance, you could do encounter therapy, you could do sexuality, you could do psychedelics, you could do just music and praise, you could do whatever the hell you want as your technology, psychotechnologies, but have it on a rotating basis. Have it be a man and a woman, have them be in regalia or mask. I mean, after all, like no one follows home the ringleader from Cirque du Soleil thinking that they're a magician. You know, they realize the top hat and the tails was part of the act, right? And the idea of like taking leaders who have been on stage in a ritualized role, not in a cult of personality, and then almost treat them like, I mean, again, Dave, what you just said about your CEOs, put them in the soup kitchen, like you've just come off stage. Thanks very much. You did a great job. Now go to the back and start peeling potatoes, and almost treating it like a Geiger counter of sort of golden shadow, like you've had your exposure limit for the month, no more adoration and adulation for you. And we create a decentralized community that can still be oriented around anything transcendent or numinous. And again, probably one other piece will be an emphasis on here and now and service. Right. It's only in this info marketing, new age space that all of these prosperity gospel, you can have everything you want and it's all about you and it's about your transcendence and about your material success. That's a pretty uniquely American warping. So if you have those three things, rotational leadership, returning of the golden shadow, and you have democratized techniques of ecstasy so that no one is holding the keys to the kingdom, and a return and emphasis on here and now, grounded application in community, in ecology, and in relationships, those would be at least some of the things that would come top of mind.
That's why I raised the concept of virtue ethics, all right? And I think what we're all saying in various ways is if you talk about wisdom, you're defining the problem the wrong way. If something is a retrospective emergent quality and you can recognize it when you recognize it, that's fine. It's language we use. We can use semiotics as well as language. There's all sorts of ways we can do that. But fundamentally, you need to focus on ethical interactions between people and the land they live in context. I mean, whether you want people to be ecstatic or not, I think is an open question. I think, we should always remember that Aldous Huxley saw Brave New World as a utopia, not a dystopia. I would see that as a dystopia. And I think that the traditional use of that is to allow people to escape from reality, which is a control mechanism. So I think we need to be really careful about the reemergence of that from the 70s at the moment, because it's got some of the same flavor. But focusing on short-term proximate ethical interactions will generate things which we will retrospectively talk about being wise. When we talk about wisdom practices, or we put, meditation is a very sensible thing for people to do. The minute you call it a wisdom practice, you actually damage it, in terms of the way it works.
I want to throw out one more wild card people may not be aware of. I have been very interested in experimental theater work for years and do as much as I can, and was able to do a summer internship with San Francisco Mime Troupe, which is a guerrilla theater troupe that brought in guest teachers from around the world for part of the internship. And there are esoteric theater groups that do pretty radical, wild stuff in jungles of Africa and South America, and know each other through theater groups. So there's an esoteric theater kind of wing that solves a lot of these problems because it's not personal. It is kind of what Dave's nodding at, is you get to try out different roles in a container, you get to try out different statuses, everything's fluid, and it's a learning container. It doesn't have you can do all kinds of wild things. And some of my counterexamples you can see in the entertainment industry, like pornographers, like doing all kinds of, in real life, pretty damaging, crazy stuff. And yet we're not considering them cult members. So there's something very specific about your identity being wrapped up with a thing versus having this level of indirection of like, that's just a role. That's just something I'm doing in this container in a context I'm going to put aside and not define me as myself.
There's actually really good research that suggests that this is where the original notion of the sacred comes from. The argument is that even animals don't live in the mundane world all the time. And so chimps, when they get to playing, then the lead dominant chimp will let other younger chimps throw poop at them, and dogs will handicap themselves in play. And so we start to see the beginning of the or in all these bacchanalia rituals in early hunter-gatherer tribes, the sexual mores, and the lower becomes the higher and the higher becomes the lower. And there's this sense in which there's an anthropological instinct in us to enter these non-ordinary social relationships. Even the story of the man who took the thorn out of the lion is one of these reversals of the ordinary order of things. And so I think there's something that you all are saying that's important to that. I'm going to try to build that right back to what Bard and Dave was saying. So the first thing I wrote, can publicly discussing wisdom while recommending wisdom practices lead to cult-like dynamics? Well, I'm not sure they have to lead to cult-like dynamics, but I agree with Bard. Like, if you are experimenting with different types of relations, trust relations, community relations, and you're doing that at a small scale, and you're containing that, you will be labeled as a cult. Like, you know, the Quakers some people say they're a cult. And so not talking about it inherently makes it be perceived by the larger culture as a cult. And I don't see that that's a problem. But what I will say that I truly think is important is, why do these little isolated incubators become problematic versus not? Because too many of these incubators, as Dave said, they get together to solve the problem of what should social relations be like, right? They try to define the outcome, and that inevitably gets coded in ideology. And unlike the Quakers, who say, can we make a living together? And the world steps in. The world is the great buffer. Like, well, you know, you got to get up and raise a barn, and then it's cold and you need wood. And if you've committed not to have this financial system, that's a voluntary obligation your society has made. Then the only way you can see if it's actually doable is where the rubber hits the road. And these cults, they make voluntary obligations to an ideology, and there's no where the rubber hits the road. So it becomes just a problematic cult versus a social experiment, you know? So this was like what Gandhi says, you know, get out the spinning wheel and start to spin thread. So the world, the actual world, the stubbornness of the real world is critical in social incubators, in social experiments. And in the West, we have way too many conveniences supporting these kind of parasitic cults, because people just, you know, they get money or they have funding or whatever. This is not, it's not able to have a healthy social experiment without actual functioning experimenting with the world. The world doesn't care what your ideology is, and that's where the rubber hits the road. And that's where most of these incubations and these kind of late stage capitalist experiments are they go awry. They just live in their own fantasy land. You got to let the world in, like the real world.
And the groups are too big as well, I think, Bonita. When we do peace and reconciliation, we put people together in 3s or 5s, no more than 5, from radically different backgrounds to work on something which they agree is a common problem, and let them have a conversation about the differences when they're ready to have it. If the groups get bigger than that, you can't have it anymore. And that's the point. Cults automatically become too big. So they just reinforce the belief system. There's no disruptive mechanism yet within it.
And that's the notion of the commons, is what's the common problem or the common goal or the common, you know, you can make a common obligation to have a sustainable, whatever you want to set as the set point for the experiment, but you can't. And then the culture emerges out of the necessity to make local decisions in the face of the constraints you've set on yourself, called vows or voluntary obligations, and the real world. And
that's the tail. That's the tails of a Pareto distribution.
Exactly.
You need a social process which puts people together in small numbers which can deal with situations as they arise. You can't define in advance what the solution would be. And that's the problem with an overly eschatological approach to change. It tries to define the solution in advance rather than creating a process through which it can emerge.
And then what you will see in these groups is you'll go in as an outside observer and you'll say, oh, there's a hierarchy there. But I call it a sense making up hierarchy, so that actions taken at the local level flow up as information to be organized, rather than instructions or rules flowing down as instructions to be followed. So when you go in, you'll see, oh yeah, there's a kind of a hierarchical relationship, but it doesn't have to be from instructions to be followed. It can flow as an up hierarchy. And so some of these, I think some of these concepts that are in that space are very important to, this notion of a wisdom commons. What's the common ground that you're dedicated to?
This feels like a really good place to close, and perhaps like we can close by going around the panel one last time, real brief. Anything salient for you in this session that you'll take away into your personal inquiry, and any parting words you'd like to leave us with here today at the Stoa? Maybe we can go in the same order that we started with Jamie going first.
I mean, I would just say, we are fairly and squarely smack dab in the middle of the human condition. How do we do this monkeys with clothes thing? And can we explore what's next based on our world, current conditions and values? Some new way of doing this, that builds on tradition and innovates forward. So what does ethical culture look like that doesn't require the subjugation of the self, to a specific, and harnesses the power of collective emergent coherence? And that's potentially our generations to do. And can we look back to the baby boomers and all of the wisdom from there? Can we understand the mechanisms and the structures that are sort of thwarting and supporting that? And can we all just, roll up our sleeves and try and encourage each other along the way?
Jill, do you want to go next, then Dave, then Bonita?
Sure. Yeah, I think the takeaway I'd like to leave with everyone is I think there's an untapped resource out there, which are many existing communities we absolutely should draw from and test. If rather, I don't think it's necessarily a search for an innovation. That's very much of a that's Silicon Valley perspective. I think that it can be very much like you have an idea and you go talk to people that have the tacit knowledge. You start to call and bring in the, as Dave might say, enabling constraints, or what are the constraints, as we've started to do here, to start to fill in for yourself, and everybody who's interested in this, if that's what they're interested in, fill in through some sort of mentoring and interaction with people that have spent decades doing various flavors of these experiments and can fill in much more of that. I feel like there's just a huge opportunity there that I'd love hosted somewhere. So I'll leave it with that.
I think apart from the fact I've got 3 more books I've now got to read, so that's always a good thing coming out of Stoa. I think, and I genuinely think it's about small things. It's about micro nudges. It's about micro interactions. It's about small things in different contexts. And it's not about grand visions or grand narratives or transcendent visions or rapture or anything like that. It's about changing the way that people interact with themselves. And I'd emphasize this with the planet as well. And we've been talking with Tyson and his mates out in Australia about a peace and reconciliation process with the planet, because God, do we need that? And it's not about the individual, and it's not about visions, and it's not about things which we will all understand with the benefit of hindsight, but we can't design them up front. Oh, and by the way, get rid of pretension and platitudes. I get really pissed off with people spouting platitudes in chat lines and elsewhere to look good, because it makes absolutely bugger all difference. It's not a real contribution.
Bonita.
You know, there's always been people who grew in wisdom. There's always people, civilizations who, as a whole civilization, but also in local communities, as Jill started off by saying, that you can point to that are wise. Children love to saddle up to wise people. And so maybe it's the wrong question. Like, maybe the question is, why are we so foolish today? And maybe there is an instinct for people to grow wise. And it's a matter of taking away what obstructs us and makes us grow foolish instead. So maybe that's the question.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you, Jamie, Jill, Dave, Bonita, for that engaging conversation. A lot of good threads emerged, and I like that kind of. Perhaps we can do a series at the Stoa of failed experiments and just interview people there and see what happens. So upcoming at the Stoa is on Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Escape Artists, How to Thrive as an Artist in the Age of AI with Alex Ebert. It's going to be a fun session, so you can check that out at thestoa.ca. So that being said, everyone, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa today.